Sacre bleu! The Boston Bruins really underwhelmed in a preseason game last night in Quebec City in front of all people, former captain Patrice Bergeron.
You're Locked On Bruins, your daily podcast on the Boston Bruins, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, Bruins fans? TGIF, and welcome back to the Locked On Boston Bruins podcast. I'm your host, Ian McLaren, and this is a daily show where we discuss all things Spoke to Be. Today is Friday, October 4th, and I want to thank you so much for making Locked On Bruins part of your daily routine. Free and available on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And before we get started, a quick reminder, you can find the podcast on social media at Locked NHL Bruins. You can find me, my hockey thoughts, dad jokes at Ian C. McLaren. Please do subscribe on your favorite podcast app and on YouTube so that you do not miss a thing. If you failed to watch last night's game against the Los Angeles Kings in Quebec City, you didn't really miss a thing either, because it was a pretty underwhelming performance by the boys in black and gold. And the big storyline, as we look today at the storylines, stats, and signals from that game, was the play of Joonas Korpisalo. And while he wasn't exactly aided a ton by the guys in front of him, he did allow 4 goals on 26 shots, a couple softies, a hat-trick score by Quinton Byfield, and not as promising a start as we would have liked. And it's a reminder that, as good as he has been so far for the Bruins in the preseason, he's coming off a pretty atrocious season with the Ottawa Senators. Yes, they were very poor defensively, but as I've been trying to reiterate time and time again, the Bruins were not that great of a defensive team last year. They were regularly outshot, out-attempted, expected goals below 50%, and Linus Ullmark and Jeremy Swayman really bailed them out on a consistent basis. The Bruins had the third best save percentage in the NHL. If you're coming in with Korpisalo and Brandon Bussi, you cannot expect those numbers, and you cannot expect to be bailed out by the goaltending each and every night. Now, Korpisalo did tell reporters that he does feel sharp. He wasn't happy with a couple goals he let in last night, but it's the preseason. It is what it is. You got to be better, and you learn things, and we move on. He did make 22 saves on 26 shots. Probably his final preseason appearance, as the Bruins do have one more preseason game, even though the NHL regular season begins today overseas. And he will be in the net on Tuesday as they take on the Florida Panthers. I believe his preseason save percentage overall is at .904, which is, okay. His best showing came last week against the Philadelphia Flyers, when he turned away 37 shots in an overtime loss. He has the ability to be an above average goaltender, but can he carry the load for 60, 70% of the time in Swayman's absence? And how quickly will the pressure of being the number one, when it was expected that he would be the backup or even sent to the AHL to begin the season, how is that going to affect him? One of the knocks on him last season was opening goals. The Senators allowed a goal on the first or second shot quite regularly last year. So if the Bruins get behind the 8 ball, it's going to be a tough go for them early on. And don't forget, even when Linus Ullmark came from Buffalo, signed as a free agent, it took him a while to get acclimated to the Bruins system, their style, to the city, to the teammates, to the room. So even he needed a grace period before busting out and becoming the Vezina winner that we all knew and loved as a member of the Boston Bruins. So hopefully things aren't too disastrous to start the season, because there was that fan behind Korpisalo last night. You could see the sign, take the 64 or go. Not referring to Nintendo 64, but the $64 million that was reportedly, or that was offered by the Boston Bruins, according to Cam Neely. We'll talk about Swayman later on in the podcast, but if the Bruins have any hope of contending, they need Jeremy Swayman. Or if he's going to be traded, to acquire another goaltender in the mix. The other storyline last night was the captain, former captain, being in the house. Patrice Bergeron was met with much love by the home crowd. Remember, there was the talk a few years ago of, Kent Hughes has gone to Montreal, so maybe Bergeron will want to play for the Habs. No, this guy grew up closer to Quebec City. He was a Nordiques fan growing up, and he is a legend in that area and was applauded as such. He even jumped on the Bruins Twitter and was serving as admin for the night. And he admitted that he would want to be involved in some capacity if Quebec City was ever given an NHL team again. He said it's something he would definitely consider. He was a big fan growing up, and it would definitely be special. But with that being said, he's been part of the Bruins organization for 20 years, has a big place in his heart. So doesn't know what the real answer is to that. Obviously, it's hypothetical, but it's definitely something that he would consider. Now, I don't believe he has an official role with the Bruins, but perhaps starts there and maybe jumps to a front office position with the Nordiques if they ever come back. I firmly believe a team belongs in Quebec City. Such a beautiful city if you've never been there. Passionate hockey fan base, ability to, they regularly fill that building for their junior team. It's an NHL level building. I believe there was 17,000 plus there last night. A lot more than you're getting in Utah without obstructed seats. So if the NHL is willing to go back to Winnipeg, I really think they should be going back to Quebec City at some point as well. I know Atlanta's on the table, Kansas City, Houston as potential expansion markets, but make it an even 8 Canadian teams and put one back in Quebec City. That is my hot take for the day. Now let's discuss some stats and signals from last night's game. The key storylines: Korpisalo's poor performance. Again, wasn't really helped out by the guys in front of him. Hopefully it's just a one-off in the preseason, but the pressure is certainly going to ramp up here as the regular season approaches. We'll talk about some other stats and signals from last night's game here as the podcast continues. NFL fans, I am talking to you right now. FanDuel has an amazing way for you to get in on the action and start the season with a massive return. You can get started today with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's it. All you have to do is go over to FanDuel.com. For example, check out the over-under for points for the Boston Bruins this season. It's set at 97.5. Do you think they'll be impacted by the lack of Jeremy Swayman to start the season and go under? Or do you think they'll continue to exceed expectations and go over, put $500, and you'll get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed? When you're watching the Patriots game on the weekend, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. Go to FanDuel.com and get that $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Now, for some inexplicable reason, it's very difficult to find some stats from last night's game in Quebec City. You would think that in this day and age, they would be readily available. We don't have time on ice stats, for example. We don't have necessarily a full box score, which is pretty ridiculous. What we do know, of course, is that Quinton Byfield led the way for the Kings with 3 goals. Kevin Fiala had 2 assists. Philip Deneau was the third star of the game. When it comes to the Bruins, their goal was scored by one of the more unlikely candidates, Patrick Brown. The Bruins, as a team, I believe were outshot pretty dramatically. And that was one of the reasons why they were not as successful last night. They weren't getting the puck on net. You had David Rittich in net for the Los Angeles Kings, not an elite level goaltender. They should be peppering the net with shots, and they were outshot 26-14, almost doubled in shots, 11-2 in the first period. Things evened out a little bit, but already really behind the 8 ball. Patrick Brown had the 1 goal on 2 shots, and 2 shots was the maximum achieved by any Boston Bruin. That was matched by Tyler Johnson, who continues to fight for a spot on the roster, as well as Jeffrey Veal, who sticking around, getting 7 minutes in penalties, one of the more rambunctious Bruins on the night. First period, he laid a hit on Alex Turcotte, drew the ire of some of his teammates, and that was pretty much all the action in the first period. Fabian Lysell was recalled for this game, maybe the last chance to make a positive impression. He had 1 shot and was a -2 in this game. But everybody was pretty quiet. David Pastrnak only had 1 shot. Some guys without a shot. Charlie Coyle, -2. 0 shots on goal. Riley Tufte, 0 shots on goal. It was a tough night for the Bruins overall. The big stat, of course, was .846. That was the save percentage notched by Joonas Korpisalo in what, of course, was a very, shall we say, poor start. Again, go to natural stat trick, stats unavailable. So I guess we'll just skip over the stats part for this game because they're not available. The signals, well, I would imagine that things are pretty much status quo when it comes to preseason going into the regular season. Now, before this game, it was announced that Brad Marchand wouldn't play with illness. Hopefully, he's able to recover before Tuesday. Matt Poitras's day-to-day. Tyler Johnson remains unsigned, but I think he remains in line to grab a roster spot. We're signaling here that I'd say the lineup is pretty much set for opening night. We have Pavel Zacha, Elias Lindholm, David Pastrnak on the top line, Brad Marchand, Charlie Coyle on the second line, Trent Frederick on the third line, and then we're looking at some combination of Matt Poitras if he's healthy, Justin Brazeau, Morgan Geekie, Tyler Johnson. Max Jones did make his preseason debut last night for the Bruins. He had 1 shot. I'm expecting him to be on the 4th line with John Beecher and Mark Kostelic. The top 6 defense is very set. We had pretty much what we'll see last night, although Parker Witherspoon was in there for Andrew Peeke. Mason Lohrei didn't have a great night, -2 with only 1 shot on goal. Some costly turnovers in there. Same with Witherspoon. He's looking to make the jump into the top 6, but likely 7th defenseman at best. I'm interested to see what the lineup will be for tomorrow night, whether or not the Bruins will rest a bunch of their guys. Again, the regular season already begins today. Overseas with the Sabres and the Devils taking each other on in Prague. The Bruins lineup pretty much set. They'll likely keep some guys out of the lineup and not risk injury with the regular season set to begin on Tuesday. Mark Diver of covering the Providence Bruins saying he's not expecting Georgi Merkulov, Riley Duran, Frederic Brunet, John Farinacci, Kuntar, Callahan, Mark McLaughlin in the Providence lineup for tonight's preseason game in Springfield. Those guys will likely be up and playing in the preseason finale on Saturday against the Washington Capitals. So those are the storylines, the stats, signals from last night's game. Of course, we can't have a Locked On Boston Bruins episode these days without a Jeremy Swayman update, and we'll talk about that here as the podcast continues. Now, as evidenced by that sign behind Joonas Korpisalo last night, public sentiment may be turning more in the Boston Bruins' favor when it comes to the contract stalemate with Jeremy Swayman. It's out there that there's 8 times 8 on the table for Swayman. And that coupled with the quotes from the Amazon series that kind of indicate that he was thinking about his contract immediately after the Game 6 loss to the Panthers, even during the series against the Maple Leafs. He was considering the possibility of being traded if his ask was too much. He had it checked on his vision board that he had to improve in the playoffs, which was a knock on him during the arbitration hearing, not this summer, but last summer. All of that kind of speaks to an apparent picture of Swayman as maybe not a team first guy. And that seems to be rubbing fans the wrong way and some media types as well. I'm all for players getting their bag. I'm all for Swayman maximizing his value. I do think that 8 times 8 is a very fair offer from the Boston Bruins perspective. But I also see from Swayman's perspective that if he continues on this trajectory, which there's every reason to believe he will, that he could be extremely undervalued at $8 million by the end of that contract. And that's the risk you take by signing a long-term deal. That it could, on the team side, you take the risk that maybe this guy falls apart and you're committed at $8 million for the next 8 years, and he's not a high-end elite level goalie. I don't really think that's going to happen. There's every reason to believe that Jeremy Swayman is who he is. What we've seen from him is what you can expect moving forward. And he'll be a perennial Vezina candidate, winning playoff rounds for the Boston Bruins, hopefully hoisting the cup at some point. And if he can achieve all that while making $8 million, that's a win for the team and for him, obviously, because it cements his legacy. At the same time, you look at the way the cap is projected to go up. You look at how valuable he is to the team. And in 2032, when that contract expires, he could have left a ton of money on the table. Maybe the resolution here is to go 4 years, $8-9 million, and then bet on yourself and get that big money contract when you're still fairly young, right in the prime of your career. Jeremy Swayman, of course, is still fairly young. He's 25 years old, going to turn 26 next month. 4-year deal would take him to his age 30 season. And then you still have the opportunity to cash in at that point. If you sign an 8-year deal now, you'll be, turning 34? Probably not going to get a big money deal at that age. So, again, chicken egg situation. How is this going to break? Now, it was interesting this morning to see Trent Frederick was asked about the arbitration process, which he got a 2-year, $2.3 million deal in arbitration, which was quite fair. Obviously, Jeremy Swayman took the arbitration process quite personally, and those hard feelings are spilling over into his ask, into the docuseries on Amazon, and Trent Frederick had a different perspective. He got to read everything the Bruins had to say. Some people handle it differently. The team is going to have different things they're going to say about each person. He didn't want to get too much into it, but he did say it's not necessarily that they mean it. The team comes in with their offer, which is traditionally pretty low. The player comes in with his ask, which is traditionally pretty high. And then they meet in the middle. And each side presents an argument for why they believe their side of things is most correct. And Frederick kind of compared it to being in court and having a defense attorney. There's people that defend murderers, he said. They might not really mean it, but it's just part of the job. He said for him, it wasn't that bad. It's just business. Swayman continues to hold his ground. Public opinion is on the Bruins side. I mentioned that article from Fluto Shinzawa on The Athletic. They ran a poll. The majority of people believe Cam Neely is telling the truth, that the Bruins did offer $64 million. Only 14.5% of people out of 1,431 votes believe that Louis Gross was telling the truth when he said he never heard that number. 91.5% of the 1,440 voters believe that 8 years, $64 million is a fair deal for Swayman. Out of 1,420 votes, 75% believe Swayman is asking too much. And 417 people believe if that 8.8 million is not fair, 64.5 believe $8.5 million is fair. Should they compromise at 4 years, 7.25 annually? It's kind of split there, but that might be the way to go. A bridge deal to take him through these next 4 years and cash in when he's almost 30 years old. The Bruins, 70% of people believe the Bruins will still be a playoff team if Swayman misses significant time. I'm not in that boat. I think if Swayman does miss, or if he holds out until December 1st or doesn't play at all, I don't know if the Bruins are a playoff team with Joonas Korpisalo in net. So, where does that leave us? Well, we are 4 days away from the season opener. We've already heard that Korpisalo is going to be the opening night starter. Even if Jeremy Swayman were to sign right this second, it would take some practices and reps to get him up to speed. So they're already behind the 8 ball when it comes to having their best possible lineup on the ice. By all indications, Swayman and his agent are still in a holding pattern as to whether or not they're willing to come back to the table or if there will be a public trade request. And that's certainly a possibility. If that happens, we'll explore the options. I really hope it doesn't, and that we can just proceed with a Swayman Korpisalo tandem, which I think is the best possible option at this point. Swayman getting the majority of the starts, Korpisalo coming in, playing 1 out of every 3 games, let's say, and the Bruins, as an improved team defensively, should be very, very good this season. But that's with Swayman in the lineup. That's it for today's episode of Locked On Boston Bruins, my friends. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I hope you are all having a great week, taking care of yourselves, taking care of each other. On Monday's episode, we'll kind of recap the preseason game against the Capitals, which I believe will be fairly inconsequential considering there will likely be a bunch of AHL guys in the lineup. We'll outline some expectations, predictions for the upcoming season, and bring you everything you need to know about the Boston Bruins, because that's what we do here on the Locked On Boston Bruins podcast. Do check out Locked On NHL next, also on YouTube and in your feeds. Please subscribe to both podcasts and never miss a thing when it comes to our favorite hockey team and the NHL in general. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your favorite team every single day. Have a great weekend, friends.